By 5 o'clock that evening, this amazing Cosser, with no appearance of hurry at all, had got all the stuff for his fight with Insurgent Bigness out of earshot and on the road to Hickley-Brow. 2 barrels of paraffin and a load of dry brushwood he had bought in earshot, plentiful sacks of sulphur, 8 big game guns and ammunition, 3 light breech-loaders, with small-shot ammunition for the wasps, a hatchet, 2 billhooks, a pick and 3 spades, 2 coils of rope, some bottled beer, soda, and whiskey, 1 gross of packets of rat poison, and cold provisions for 3 days, had come down from London. All these things he had sent on in a coal trolley and a hay wagon, in the most businesslike way, except the guns and ammunition, which were stuck under the seat of the Red Lion wagonette appointed to bring on Redwood and the 5 picked men who had come up from Ealing at Cosser's summons. Cosser conducted all these transactions with an invincible air of commonplace, in spite of the fact that earshot was in a panic about the rats, and all the drivers had to be specially paid. All the shops were shut in the place, and scarcely a soul abroad in the street, and when he banged at a door, a window was apt to open. He seemed to consider that the conduct of business from open windows was an entirely legitimate and obvious method. Finally, he and Bensington got the Red Lion dog-cart and set off with a wagonette to overtake the baggage. They did this a little beyond the crossroads, and so reached Hickley-Brow first. Bensington, with a gun between his knees, sitting beside Cosser in the dog-cart, developed a long germinated amazement. All they were doing was, no doubt, as Cosser insisted, quite the obvious thing to do, only... in England, one so rarely does the obvious thing. He glanced from his neighbor's feet to the boldly sketched hands upon the reins. Cosser had apparently never driven before, and he was keeping the line of least resistance down the middle of the road by some, no doubt quite obvious, but certainly unusual, light of his own. Why don't we all do the obvious? Thought Bensington. How the world would travel if one did! I wonder, for instance, why I don't do such a lot of things I know would be all right to do, things I want to do. Is everybody like that, or is it peculiar to me? He plunged into obscure speculation about the will. He thought of the complex, organized futilities of the daily life, and in contrast with them, the plain and manifest things to do, the sweet and splendid things to do, that some incredible influences will never permit us to do. Cousin Jane? Cousin Jane, he perceived, was important in the question, in some subtle and difficult way. Why should we, after all, eat, drink, and sleep, remain unmarried, go here, abstain from going there, all out of deference to Cousin Jane? She became symbolical without ceasing to be incomprehensible. A stile and a path across the fields caught his eye, and reminded him of that other bright day, so recent in time, so remote in its emotions, when he had walked from earshot to the experimental farm to see the giant chicks. Fate plays with us. "Chuck, chuck," said Cosser. "Get up." It was a hot midday afternoon, not a breath of wind, and the dust was thick in the roads. Few people were about, but the deer beyond the park palings browsed in profound tranquillity. They saw a couple of big wasps stripping a gooseberry bush just outside Hickley-Brow, and another was crawling up and down the front of the little grocer's shop in the village street, trying to find an entry. The grocer was dimly visible within, with an ancient fowling-piece in hand, watching its endeavors. The driver of the wagonette pulled up outside the Jolly Drovers and informed Redwood that his part of the bargain was done. In this contention he was presently joined by the drivers of the wagon and the trolley. Not only did they maintain this, but they refused to let the horses be taken further. "Them big rats is nuts on horses," the trolley driver kept on repeating. Sir surveyed the controversy for a moment. "Get the things out of that wagonette," he said, and one of his men, a tall, fair, dirty engineer, obeyed. "Gimme that shotgun," said Cosser. He placed himself between the drivers. "We don't want you to drive," he said. "You can say what you like," he conceded, "but we want these horses." They began to argue, but he continued speaking. "If you try and assault us, I shall, in self-defense, let fly at your legs. The horses are going on." He treated the incident as closed. "Get up on that wagon, Flack," he said to a thick-set, wiry little man. Boone, take the trolley." The two drivers blustered to Redwood. "You've done your duty to your employers," said Redwood. "You stop in this village until we come back. No one will blame you, seeing we've got guns. We've no wish to do anything unjust or violent, but this occasion is pressing. I'll pay if anything happens to the horses, never fear." "That's all right," said Cossar, who rarely promised. They left the wagonette behind, and the men who were not driving went afoot. Over each shoulder sloped a gun. It was the oddest little expedition for an English country road, more like a Yankee party trekking west in the good old Indian days. They went up the road, until at the crest by the stile they came into sight of the experimental farm. They found a little group of men there with a gun or so. The two Fulchers were among them. And one man, a stranger from Medston, stood out before the others and watched the place through an opera glass. These men turned about and stared at Redwood's party. "Anything fresh?" said Cossar. "The Waspses keeps a-comin' and a-goin'," said old Fulcher. "Can't see as they bring anything." "The canary creepers got in among the pine trees now," said the man with the lorgnette. "It wasn't there this morning. You can see it grow while you watch it." He took out a handkerchief and wiped his object glasses with careful deliberation. "I reckon you're going down there," ventured Skelmersdale. "Will you come?" said Cossar. Skelmersdale seemed to hesitate. "It's an all-night job." Skelmersdale decided that he wouldn't. "Rats about?" asked Cossar. "One was up in the pines this morning. Rabbitin', we reckon." Cossar slouched on to overtake his party. Bensington, regarding the experimental farm under his hand, was able to gauge now the vigor of the food. His first impression was that the house was smaller than he had thought, very much smaller. His second was to perceive that all the vegetation between the house and the pinewood had become extremely large. The roof over the well peeped amidst tussocks of grass a good 8 feet high, and the canary creeper wrapped about the chimney-stack and gesticulated with stiff tendrils towards the heavens. Its flowers were vivid yellow splashes, distinctly visible as separate specks this mile away. A great green cable had writhed across the big wire enclosures of the giant hen's run, and flung twining leaf stems about 2 outstanding pines. Fully half as tall as these was the grove of nettles running round behind the cart-shed. The whole prospect, as they drew nearer, became more and more suggestive of a raid of pygmies upon a doll's house that has been left in a neglected corner of some great garden. There was a busy coming and going from the wasp's nest, they saw. A swarm of black shapes interlaced in the air above the rusty hill front beyond the pine cluster. And ever and again one of these would dart up into the sky with incredible swiftness and soar off upon some distant quest. Their humming became audible at more than half a mile's distance from the experimental farm. Once a yellow-striped monster dropped towards them and hung for a space, watching them with its great compound eyes, but at an ineffectual shot from Cossar it darted off again. Down in a corner of the field, away to the right, several were crawling about over some ragged bones that were probably the remains of the lamb the rats had brought from Huckster's farm. The horses became very restless as they drew near these creatures. None of the party was an expert driver, and they had to put a man to lead each horse and encourage it with a voice. They could see nothing of the rats as they came up to the house, and everything seemed perfectly still except for the rising and falling "woozzz, woozzoo" of the wasp's nest. They led the horses into the yard, and one of Cossar's men, seeing the door open — the whole of the middle portion of the door had been gnawed out — walked into the house. Nobody missed him for the time, the rest being occupied with the barrels of paraffin, and the first intimation they had of his separation from them was the report of his gun and the whiz of his bullet. Bang! Bang! Both barrels! And his first bullet, it seems, went through the cask of sulphur, smashed out a stave from the further side, and filled the air with yellow dust. Redwood had kept his gun in hand, and let fly at something grey that leapt past him. He had a vision of the broad hindquarters, the long scaly tail and long soles of the hind feet of a rat, and fired his second barrel. He saw Bensington drop as the beast vanished round the corner. Then for a time everybody was busy with a gun. For 3 minutes lives were cheap at the experimental farm, and the banging of guns filled the air. Redwood, careless of Bensington in his excitement, rushed in pursuit, and was knocked headlong by a mass of brick fragments, mortar, plaster, and rotten lath splinters that came flying out at him as a bullet whacked through the wall. He found himself sitting on the ground with blood on his hands and lips, and a great stillness brooded over all about him. Then a flattish voice from within the house remarked, "Gee whiz!" "Hello?" said Redwood. "Hello there," answered the voice. And then, "Did you chaps get him?" A sense of the duties of friendship returned to Redwood. "Is Mr. Bensington hurt?" he said. The man inside heard imperfectly. "No one ain't to blame if I ain't," said the voice inside. It became clearer to Redwood that he must have shot Bensington. He forgot the cuts upon his face, arose, and came back to find Bensington seated on the ground and rubbing his shoulder. Bensington looked over his glasses. "We peppered him, Redwood," he said, and then, "he tried to jump over me and knocked me down, but I let him have it with both barrels, and my, how it has hurt my shoulder, to be sure." A man appeared in the doorway. "I got him once in the chest and once in the side," he said. "Where's the wagons?" said Cossar, appearing amidst a thicket of gigantic canary creeper leaves. It became evident, to Redwood's amazement, first, that no one had been shot, and secondly, that the trolley and wagon had shifted 50 yards, and were now standing with interlocked wheels amidst the tangled distortions of Skinner's kitchen garden. The horses had stopped their plunging. Halfway towards them, the burst barrel of sulphur lay in the path, with a cloud of sulphur dust above it. He indicated this to Cossar, and walked towards it. "Has anyone seen that rat?" shouted Cossar, following. "I got him in between the ribs once, and once in the face as he turned on me." They were joined by 2 men as they worried at the locked wheels. "I killed that rat," said one of the men. "Have they got him?" asked Cossar. "Jim Bates has found him beyond the hedge. I got him just as he came round the corner. Whack! Behind the shoulder." When things were a little shipshape again, Redwood went and stared at the huge, misshapen corpse. The brute lay on its side, with its body slightly bent. Its rodent teeth overhanging its receding lower jaw gave its face a look of colossal feebleness, of weak avidity. It seemed not in the least ferocious or terrible. Its forepaws reminded him of lank, emaciated hands. Except for one neat round hole with a scorched rim on either side of its neck, the creature was absolutely intact. He meditated over this fact for some time. "There must have been 2 rats," he said at last, turning away. "Yes, and the one that everybody hit got away." "I am certain that my own shot—" A canary creeper leaf tendril, engaged in that mysterious search for a holdfast which constitutes a tendril's career, bent itself engagingly towards his neck, and made him step aside hastily. "Whooz!" from the distant wasp's nest. "Whoozoo!" 5. This incident left the party alert, but not unstrung. They got their stores into the house, which had evidently been ransacked by the rats after the flight of Mrs. Skinner, and 4 of the men took the 2 horses back to Hickley-Brow. They dragged the dead rat through the hedge and into a position commanded by the windows of the house, and incidentally came upon a cluster of giant earwigs in the ditch. These creatures dispersed hastily, but Cossar reached out incalculable limbs, and managed to kill several with his boots and gun butt. Then 2 of the men hacked through several of the main stems of the canary creeper. Huge cylinders they were, a couple of feet in diameter, that came out by the sink at the back. And while Cossar set the house in order for the night, Bensington, Redwood, and one of the assistant electricians went cautiously round by the fowl runs in search of the rat-holes. They skirted the giant nettles widely, for these huge weeds threatened them with poison thorns a good inch long. Then round beyond the gnawed, dismantled stile, they came abruptly on the huge, cavernous throat of the most westerly of the giant rat-holes, an evil-smelling profundity that drew them up into a line together. "I hope they'll come out," said Redwood, with a glance at the penthouse of the well. "If they don't," reflected Bensington. "They will," said Redwood. They meditated. "We shall have to rig up some sort of flare if we do go in," said Redwood. They went up a little path of white sand through the pine wood, and halted presently within sight of the wasp holes. The sun was setting now, and the wasps were coming home for good. Their wings in the golden light made twirling halos about them. The three men peered out from under the trees. They did not care to go right to the edge of the wood, and watched these tremendous insects drop and crawl for a little, and enter and disappear. "They will be still in a couple of hours from now," said Redwood. "This is like being a boy again." "We can't miss those holes," said Bensington, "even if the night is dark. By the by, about the light—" "Full moon," said the electrician. "I looked it up." They went back and consulted with Cossar. He said that, obviously, they must get the sulphur, nitre, and plaster of Paris through the wood before twilight, and for that they broke bulk and carried the sacks. After the necessary shouting of the preliminary directions, never a word was spoken, and as the buzzing of the wasp's nest died away, there was scarcely a sound in the world but the noise of footsteps, the heavy breathing of burdened men, and the thud of the sacks. They all took turns at that labor, except Mr. Bensington, who was manifestly unfit. He took post in the Skinners' bedroom with a rifle, to watch the carcass of the dead rat, and of the others, they took turns to rest from sack-carrying, and to keep watch 2 at a time upon the rat-holes behind the nettle grove. The pollen sacks of the nettles were ripe, and every now and then the vigil would be enlivened by the dehiscence of these, the bursting of the sacks sounding exactly like the crack of a pistol, and the pollen grains as big as buckshot pattered all about them. Mr. Bensington sat at his window on a hard horsehair-stuffed armchair, covered by a grubby antimacassar that had given a touch of social distinction to the Skinners' sitting-room for many years. His unaccustomed rifle rested on the sill, and his spectacles anon watched the dark bulk of the dead rat in the thickening twilight, anon wandered about him in curious meditation. There was a faint smell of paraffin without, for one of the casks leaked, and it mingled with a less unpleasant odor arising from the hacked and crushed creeper. Within, when he turned his head, a blend of faint domestic scents, beer, cheese, rotten apples, and old boots as the leading motifs, was full of reminiscences of the vanished Skinners. He regarded the dim room for a space. The furniture had been greatly disordered, perhaps by some inquisitive rat, but a coat upon a clothes-peg on the door, a razor and some dirty scraps of paper, and a piece of soap that had hardened through years of disuse into a horny cube, were redolent of Skinner's distinctive personality. It came to Bensington's mind with a complete novelty of realization that in all probability the man had been killed and eaten, at least in part, by the monster that now lay dead there in the darkling. To think of all that a harmless-looking discovery in chemistry may lead to! Here he was, in homely England, and yet in infinite danger, sitting out alone with a gun, in a twilight-ruined house, remote from every comfort, his shoulder dreadfully bruised from a gun-kick, and... By Jove! He grasped now how profoundly the order of the universe had changed for him. He had come right away to this amazing experience without even saying a word to his cousin Jane. What must she be thinking of him? He tried to imagine it, and he could not. He had an extraordinary feeling that she and he were parted forever and would never meet again. He felt he had taken a step and come into a world of new immensities. What other monsters might not those deepening shadows hide? The tips of the giant nettles came out sharp and black against the pale green and amber of the western sky. Everything was very still indeed. He wondered why he could not hear the others away there around the corner of the house. The shadow in the cart-shed was now an abysmal black. Bang! 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 A sequence of echoes and a shout. A long silence. Bang! And a diminuendo of echoes. Stillness. Then, thank goodness, Redwood and Cossar were coming out of the inaudible darknesses, and Redwood was calling, "Bensington! Bensington, we've bagged another of the rats." "Cossar's bagged another of the rats." 6. When the expedition had finished refreshment, the night had fully come. The stars were at their brightest, and a growing pallor towards Hankey heralded the moon. The watch on the rat-holes had been maintained, but the watchers had shifted to the hill slope above the holes, feeling this a safer firing point. They squatted there in a rather abundant dew, fighting the damp with whiskey. The others rested in the house, and the 3 leaders discussed the night's work with the men. The moon rose towards midnight, and as soon as it was clear of the downs, everyone except the rat-hole sentinels started off in single file, led by Cossar, towards the wasp's nest. So far as the wasp's nest went, they found their task exceptionally easy. Astonishingly easy. Except that it was a longer labor, it was no graver affair than any common wasp's nest might have been. Danger there was, no doubt, danger to life, but it never so much as thrust its head out of that portentous hillside. They stuffed in the sulphur and niter, they bunged the holes soundly, and fired their trains. Then, with a common impulse, all the party but Cossar turned and ran athwart the long shadows of the pines, and, finding Cossar had stayed behind, came to a halt together in a knot, 100 yards away, convenient to a ditch that offered cover. Just for a minute or two, the moonlit night, all black and white, was heavy with a suffocated buzz that rose and mingled to a roar, a deep, abundant note, and culminated and died. And then, almost incredibly, the night was still. "By Jove!" said Bensington, almost in a whisper. "It's done!" All stood intent. The hillside above the black point-lace of the pine shadows seemed as bright as day and as colorless as snow. The setting plaster in the holes positively shone. Cossar's loose framework moved towards them. "So far," said Cossar. Crack! Bang! A shot from near the house, and then stillness. "What's that?" said Bensington. "One of the rats put its head out," suggested one of the men. "By the by, we left our guns up there," said Redwood. "By the sacks." Everyone began to walk towards the hill again. "That must be the rats," said Bensington. "Obviously," said Cossar, gnawing his fingernails. Bang! "Hullo?" said one of the men. Then, abruptly, there came a shout, 2 shots, a loud shout that was almost a scream, 3 shots in rapid succession, and a splintering of wood. All these sounds were very clear and very small in the immense stillness of the night. Then for some moments nothing but a minute muffled confusion from the direction of the rat-holes, and then again a wild yell. Each man found himself running hard for the guns. 2 shots. Bensington found himself, gun in hand, going hard through the pine trees after a number of receding backs. It is curious that the thought uppermost in his mind at that moment was the wish that his cousin Jane could see him. His bulbous, slashed boots flew out in wild strides, and his face was distorted into a permanent grin, because that wrinkled his nose and kept his glasses in place. Also, he held the muzzle of his gun projecting straight before him as he flew through the checkered moonlight. The man who had run away met them full tilt. He had dropped his gun. "Hello," said Cossar, and caught him in his arms. "What's this?" "They came out together," said the man. "The rats?" "Yes, 6 of them." "Where's Flack?" "Down." "What's he say?" panted Bensington, coming up unheeded. "Flack's down." "He fell down. They came out one after the other." "What?" "Made a rush. I fired both barrels first." "You left Flack?" "They were on to us." "Come on," said Cossar. "You come with us. Where's Flack? Show us." The whole party moved forward. Further details of the engagement dropped from the man who had run away. The others clustered about him, except Cossar, who led. "Where are they?" "Back in their holes, perhaps. I cleared. They made a rush for their holes." "What do you mean? Did you get behind them?" "We got down by their holes. Saw 'em come out, you know, and tried to cut 'em off. They lolloped out like rabbits. We ran down and let fly. They ran about wild after our first shot and suddenly came at us. Went for us." "How many?" 6 or 7. Cossar led the way to the edge of the pine wood and halted. "Do you mean they got Flack?" asked someone. "One of 'em was on to him." "Didn't you shoot?" "How could I?" "Everyone loaded?" said Cossar over his shoulder. There was a confirmatory movement. "But Flack," said one. "Dear mean, Flack," said another. "There's no time to lose," said Cossor, and shouted, "Flack!" as he led the way. The whole force advanced towards the rat-holes, the man who had run away a little to the rear. They went forward through the rank, exaggerated weeds, and skirted the body of the second dead rat. They were extended in a bunchy line, each man with his gun pointing forward, and they peered about them in the clear moonlight for some crumpled, ominous shape, some crouching form. They found the gun of the man who had run away very speedily. "Flack!" cried Cossor. "Flack!" "He ran past the nettles and fell down," volunteered the man who ran away. "Where?" "Round about there." "Where did he fall?" He hesitated and led them athwart the long black shadows for a space, and turned judicially. "About here, I think." "Well, he's not here now." "But his gun—" "Confound it!" swore Cossor. "Where's everything got to?" He strode a step towards the black shadows on the hillside that masked the holes, and stood staring. Then he swore again. "If they have dragged him in—" So they hung for a space, tossing each other the fragments of thoughts. Bensington's glasses flashed like diamonds as he looked from one to the other. The men's faces changed from cold clearness to mysterious obscurity as they turned them to or from the moon. Everyone spoke, no one completed a sentence. Then abruptly Cossor chose his line. He flapped limbs this way and that, and expelled orders in pellets. It was obvious he wanted lamps. Everyone except Cossor was moving towards the house. "You're going into the holes?" asked Redwood. "Obviously," said Cossor. He made it clear once more that the lamps of the cart and trolley were to be got and brought to him. Bensington, grasping this, started off along the path by the well. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Cossor's gigantic figure standing out as if he were regarding the holes pensively. At the sight, Bensington halted for a moment and half turned. They were all leaving Cossor. Cossor was able to take care of himself, of course. Suddenly, Bensington saw something that made him shout a windless, "Hi!" In a second, 3 rats had projected themselves from the dark tangle of the creeper towards Cossor. For 3 seconds, Cossor stood unaware of them, and then he had become the most active thing in the world. He didn't fire his gun. Apparently he had no time to aim or to think of aiming. He ducked a leaping rat, Bensington saw, and then smashed at the back of its head with the butt of his gun. The monster gave one leap and fell over itself. Cossor's form went right down out of sight among the reedy grass, and then he rose again, running towards another of the rats and whirling his gun overhead. A faint shout came to Bensington's ears, and then he perceived the remaining 2 rats bolting divergently, and Cossor in pursuit towards the holes. The whole thing was an affair of misty shadows. All 3 fighting monsters were exaggerated and made unreal by the delusive clearness of the light. At moments Cossor was colossal, at moments invisible. The rats flashed athwart the eye in sudden unexpected leaps, or ran with a movement of the feet so swift they seemed to run on wheels. It was all over in half a minute. No one saw it but Bensington. He could hear the others behind him still receding towards the house. He shouted something inarticulate, and then ran back towards Cossor, while the rats vanished. He came up to him outside the holes. In the moonlight, the distribution of shadows that constituted Cossor's visage intimated calm. "Hello," said Cossor. "Back already? Where's the lamps? They're all back now in their holes. One I broke the neck of as it ran past me. See? There." And he pointed a gaunt finger. Bensington was too astonished for conversation. The lamps seemed an interminable time in coming. At last they appeared. First one unwinking luminous eye, preceded by a swaying yellow glare, and then, winking now and then shining out again, 2 others. About them came little figures with little voices, and then enormous shadows. This group made, as it were, a spot of inflammation upon the gigantic dreamland of moonshine. "Flack," said the voices. "Flack." An illuminating sentence floated up. "Locked himself in the attic." Cossor was continually more wonderful. He produced great handfuls of cotton wool and stuffed them in his ears. Bensington wondered why. Then he loaded his gun with a quarter charge of powder. Who else could have thought of that? Wonderland culminated with the disappearance of Cossor's twin realms of boot sole up the central hole. Cossor was on all fours with 2 guns, one trailing on each side from a string under his chin, and his most trusted assistant, a little dark man with a grave face, was to go in stooping behind him, holding a lantern over his head. Everything had been made as sane and obvious and proper as a lunatic's dream. The wool, it seems, was on account of the concussion of the rifle. The man had some too, obviously. So long as the rats turned tail on Cossor, no harm could come to him, and directly they headed for him, he would see their eyes and fire between them. Since they would have to come down the cylinder of the hole, Cossor could hardly fail to hit them. It was, Cossor insisted, the obvious method. A little tedious, perhaps, but absolutely certain. As the assistant stooped to enter, Bensington saw that the end of a ball of twine had been tied to the tail of his coat. By this he was to draw in the rope, if it should be needed, to drag out the bodies of the rats. Bensington perceived that the object he held in his hand was Cossor's silk hat. How had it got there? It would be something to remember him by, anyhow. At each of the adjacent holes stood a little group with a lantern on the ground shining up the hole, and with one man kneeling and aiming at the round void before him, waiting for anything that might emerge. There was an interminable suspense. Then they heard Cossor's first shot, like an explosion in a mine. Everyone's nerves and muscles tightened at that, and bang, bang, bang! The rats had tried a bolt, and 2 more were dead. Then the man who held the ball of twine reported a twitching. "He's killed one in there," said Bensington, "and he wants the rope." He watched the rope creep into the hole, and it seemed as though it had become animated by a serpentine intelligence, for the darkness made the twine invisible. At last it stopped crawling, and there was a long pause. Then what seemed to Bensington the queerest monster of all crept slowly from the hole, and resolved itself into the little engineer, emerging backwards. After him, and ploughing deep furrows, Cossor's boots thrust out, and then came his lantern-illuminated back. Only 1 rat was left alive now, and this poor, doomed wretch cowered in the inmost recesses until Cossor and the lantern went in again and slew it, and finally Cossor, that human ferret, went through all the runs to make sure. "We got 'em," he said to his nearly awe-stricken company at last. "And if I hadn't been a mud-headed mucker, I should have stripped to the waist, obviously. Feel my sleeves, Bensington. I'm wet through with perspiration. Jolly hard to think of everything. Only a halfway up of whiskey can save me from a cold." 7. There were moments during that wonderful night when it seemed to Bensington that he was planned by nature for a life of fantastic adventure. This was particularly the case for an hour or so after he had taken a stiff whiskey. "Shan't go back to Sloane Street," he confided to the tall, fair, dirty engineer. "You won't, eh?" "No fear," said Bensington, nodding darkly. The exertion of dragging the 7 dead rats to the funeral pyre by the nettle grove left him bathed in perspiration, and Cossor pointed out the obvious physical reaction of whiskey to save him from the otherwise inevitable chill. There was a sort of brigand's supper in the old bricked kitchen, with a row of dead rats lying in the moonlight against the hen-runs outside, and after 30 minutes or so of rest, Cossor roused them all to the labours that were still to do. Obviously, as he said, they had to wipe the place out. No litter, no scandal, see? He stirred them up to the idea of making destruction complete. They smashed and splintered every fragment of wood in the house. They built trails of chopped wood wherever big vegetation was springing. They made a pyre for the rat bodies and soaked them in paraffin. Bensington worked like a conscientious navvy. He had a sort of climax of exhilaration and energy towards 2:00. When in the work of destruction he wielded an axe, the bravest fled his neighborhood. Afterwards he was a little sobered by the temporary loss of his spectacles, which were found for him at last in his side coat pocket. Men went to and fro about him, grimy, energetic men. Cossor moved amongst them like a god. Bensington drank that delight of human fellowship that comes to happy armies, to sturdy expeditions, never to those who live the life of the sober citizen in cities. After Cossor had taken his axe away, and set him to carry wood, he went to and fro, saying they were all good fellows. He kept on, long after he was aware of fatigue. At last all was ready, and the broaching of the paraffin began. The moon, robbed now of all its meagre night retinue of stars, shone high above the dawn. "Burn everything," said Cossor, going to and fro. "Burn the ground and make a clean sweep of it. See?" Bensington became aware of him, looking now very gaunt and horrible in the pale beginnings of the daylight, hurrying past with his lower jaw projected and a flaring torch of touchwood in his hand. "Come away," said someone, pulling Bensington's arm. The still dawn, no birds were singing there, was suddenly full of a tumultuous crackling. A little dull red flame ran about the base of the pyre, changed to blue upon the ground, and set out to clamber, leaf by leaf, up the stem of a giant nettle. A singing sound mingled with the crackling. They snatched their guns from the corner of the Skinners' living-room, and then everyone was running. Cossor came after them with heavy strides. Then they were standing, looking back at the experimental farm. It was boiling up. The smoke and flames poured out like a crowd in a panic, from doors and windows and from 1,000 cracks and crevices in the roof. Trust Cossor to build a fire! A great column of smoke, shot with blood-red tongues and darting flashes, rushed up into the sky. It was like some huge giant suddenly standing up, straining upward and abruptly spreading his great arms out across the sky. It cast the night back upon them, utterly hiding and obliterating the incandescence of the sun that rose behind it. All Hickley Brow was soon aware of that stupendous pillar of smoke, and came out upon the crest, in various déshabillés, to watch them coming. Behind, like some fantastic fungus, this smoke pillar swayed and fluctuated, up, into the sky, making the downs seem low and all other objects petty, and in the foreground, led by Cossor, the makers of this mischief followed the path, 8 little black figures coming wearily, guns shouldered, across the meadow. As Bensington looked back, there came into his jaded brain, and echoed there a familiar formula. What was it? "You have lit today. You have lit today." Then he remembered Latimer's words. "We have lit this day such a candle in England as no man may ever put out again." What a man Cossor was, to be sure! He admired his back view for a space, and was proud to have held that hat. Proud! Although he was an eminent investigator, and Cossor only engaged in applied science. Suddenly he fell shivering and yawning enormously, and wishing he was warmly tucked away in bed in his little flat that looked out upon Sloane Street. It didn't do even to think of Cousin Jane. His legs became cotton strands, his feet lead. He wondered if anyone would get them coffee in Hickley Brow. He had never been up all night for 33 years. 8. And while these 8 adventurers fought with rats about the experimental farm, 9 miles away, in the village of Cheesing Eyebright, an old lady with an excessive nose struggled with great difficulties by the light of a flickering candle. She gripped a sardine tin opener in one gnarled hand, and in the other she held a tin of Heracleophobia, which she had resolved to open or die. She struggled indefatigably, grunting at each fresh effort, while through the flimsy partition the voice of the Caddles infant wailed. "Bless his poor heart," said Mrs. Skinner, and then, with her solitary tooth biting her lip in an ecstasy of determination, "Come up!" And presently, jab! A fresh supply of the food of the gods was let loose to wreak its powers of giantry upon the world. Chapter the 4th. The Giant Children. 1. For a time at least, the spreading circle of residual consequences about the experimental farm must pass out of the focus of our narrative. How for a long time a power of bigness, in fungus and toadstool, in grass and weed, radiated from that charred, but not absolutely obliterated, center. Nor can we tell here at any length how those mournful spinsters, the 2 surviving hens, made a wonder of and a show, spent their remaining years in eggless celebrity. The reader who is hungry for fuller details in these matters is referred to the newspapers of the period, to the voluminous, indiscriminate files of the modern recording angel. Our business lies with Mr. Bensington at the focus of the disturbance. He had come back to London to find himself a quite terribly famous man. In a night the whole world had changed with respect to him. Everybody understood. Cousin Jane, it seemed, knew all about it. The people in the streets knew all about it. The newspapers, all, and more. To meet Cousin Jane was terrible, of course, but when it was over, not so terrible after all. The good woman had limits even to her power over facts. It was clear that she had communed with herself and accepted the food as something in the nature of things. She took the line of huffy dutifulness. She disapproved highly, it was evident, but she did not prohibit. The flight of Bensington, as she must have considered it, may have shaken her, and her worst was to treat him with bitter persistence for a cold he had not caught, and fatigue he had long since forgotten, and to buy him a new sort of hygienic, all-wool combination underwear that was as apt to get involved and turned partially inside out and partially not, and as difficult to get into for an absent-minded man as society. And so, for a space, and as far as this convenience left him leisure, he still continued to participate in the development of this new element in human history, the food of the gods. The public mind, following its own mysterious laws of selection, had chosen him as the one and only responsible inventor and promoter of this new wonder. It would hear nothing of Redwood, and without a protest it allowed Cossor to follow his natural impulse into a terribly prolific obscurity. Before he was aware of the drift of these things, Mr. Bensington was, so to speak, stark and dissected upon the hoardings. His baldness, his curious general pinkness, and his golden spectacles had become a national possession. Resolute young men with large, expensive-looking cameras and a general air of complete authorization took possession of the flat for brief but fruitful periods, let off flashlights in it that filled it for days with dense, intolerable vapor, and retired to fill the pages of the syndicated magazines with their admirable photographs of Mr. Bensington, complete and at home, in his second-best jacket and his slashed shoes. Other resolute-mannered persons of various ages and sexes dropped in and told him things about boom food. It was Punch first called the stuff boom food, and afterwards reproduced what they had said as his own original contribution to the interview. The thing became quite an obsession with Broadbeam, the popular humorist. He scented another confounded thing he could not understand, and he fretted dreadfully in his efforts to laugh the thing down. One saw him in clubs, a great clumsy presence with the evidences of his midnight oil burning manifest upon his large, unwholesome face, explaining to everyone he could buttonhole. "These scientific chaps, you know, haven't a sense of humor, you know. That's what it is. This science kills it." His jests at Bensington became malignant libels. An enterprising press-cutting agency sent Bensington a long article about himself from a sixpenny weekly, entitled A New Terror, and offered to supply 100 such disturbances for a guinea, and 2 extremely charming young ladies, totally unknown to him, called, and to the speechless indignation of Cousin Jane, had tea with him, and afterwards sent him their birthday books for his signature. He was speedily quite hardened to seeing his name associated with the most incongruous ideas in the public press, and to discover in the reviews articles written about boom food and himself in a tone of the utmost intimacy by people he had never heard of. And whatever delusions he may have cherished in the days of his obscurity about the pleasantness of fame were dispelled utterly and forever. At first, except for Broadbeam, the tone of the public mind was quite free from any touch of hostility. It did not seem to occur to the public mind as anything but a mere playful supposition that any more Heracleophobia was going to escape again. And it did not seem to occur to the public mind that the growing little band of babies now being fed on the food would presently be growing more up than most of us ever grow. The sort of thing that pleased the public mind was caricatures of eminent politicians after a course of boom feeding, uses of the idea on hoardings, and such edifying exhibitions as the dead wasps that had escaped the fire and the remaining hens. Beyond that, the public did not care to look, until very strenuous efforts were made to turn its eyes to the remoter consequences, and even then, for a while, its enthusiasm for action was partial. "There's always something new," said the public, a public so glutted with novelty that it would hear of the earth being split as one splits an apple without surprise, and "I wonder what they'll do next." But there were 1 or 2 people outside the public, as it were, who did already take that further glance, and some, it seems, were frightened by what they saw there. There was young Caterham, for example, cousin of the Earl of Pewterstone, and one of the most promising of English politicians, who, taking the risk of being thought a faddist, wrote a long article in the 19th Century and After to suggest its total suppression. And, in certain of his moods, there was Bensington. "They don't seem to realize," he said to Cossar. "No, they don't." "And do we? Sometimes, when I think of what it means, this poor child of Redwood's, and of course you're 3, 40 feet high, perhaps. After all, ought we to go on with it?" "Go on with it?" cried Cossar, convulsed with inelegant astonishment, and pitching his note higher than ever. "Of course you'll go on with it! What do you think you were made for? Just to loaf about between meal-times?" "Serious consequences?" he screamed. "Of course! Enormous! Obviously! Why, man, it's the only chance you'll ever get of a serious consequence, and you want to shirk it!" For a moment his indignation was speechless. "It's downright wicked," he said at last, and repeated explosively, "Wicked!" But Bensington worked in his laboratory now with more emotion than zest. He couldn't tell whether he wanted serious consequences to his life or not. He was a man of quiet tastes. It was a marvelous discovery, of course, quite marvelous, but he had already become the proprietor of several acres of scorched, discredited property near Hickley-brow at a price of nearly £90 an acre, and at times he was disposed to think this as serious a consequence of speculative chemistry as any unambitious man could wish. Of course he was famous, terribly famous. More than satisfying, altogether more than satisfying, was the fame he had attained. But the habit of research was strong in him. And at moments, rare moments in the laboratory chiefly, he would find something else than habit and Cossar's arguments to urge him to his work. This little spectacled man, poised perhaps with his slashed shoes wrapped about the legs of his high stool, and his hand upon the tweezer of his balance-weights, would have again a flash of that adolescent vision, would have a momentary perception of the eternal unfolding of the seed that had been sown in his brain, would see, as it were, in the sky, behind the grotesque shapes and accidents of the present, the coming world of giants and all the mighty things the future has in store, vague and splendid, like some glittering palace seen suddenly in the passing of a sunbeam far away. And presently it would be with him as though that distant splendor had never shone upon his brain, and he would perceive nothing ahead but sinister shadows, vast declivities and darknesses, inhospitable immensities, cold, wild, and terrible things. 2. Amidst the complex and confused happenings, the impacts from the great outer world that constituted Mr. Bensington's fame, a shining and active figure presently became conspicuous, became almost, as it were, a leader and marshal of these externalities in Mr. Bensington's eyes. This was Dr. Winkles, that convincing young practitioner who has already appeared in this story as the means whereby Redwood was able to convey the food to his son. Even before the great outbreak, it was evident that the mysterious powders Redwood had given him had awakened this gentleman's interest immensely, and so soon as the first wasps came, he was putting 2 and 2 together. He was the sort of doctor that is in manners, in morals, in methods and appearance, most succinctly and finally expressed by the word rising. He was large and fair, with a hard, alert, superficial, aluminum-colored eye, and hair like chalk mud, even-featured and muscular about the clean-shaven mouth, erect in figure and energetic in movement, quick and spinning on the heel, and he wore long frock-coats, black silk ties, and plain gold studs and chains, and his silk hats had a special shape and brim that made him look wiser and better than anybody. He looked as young or old as anybody grown up. And after that first wonderful outbreak, he took to Bensington and Redwood and the food of the gods with such a convincing air of proprietorship that at times, in spite of the testimony of the press to the contrary, Bensington was disposed to regard him as the original inventor of the whole affair. "These accidents," said Winkles, when Bensington hinted at the dangers of further escapes, "are nothing. Nothing. The discovery is everything. Properly developed, suitably handled, sanely controlled, we have something very portentous indeed in this food of ours. We must keep our eye on it. We mustn't let it out of control again, and we mustn't let it rest." He certainly did not mean to do that. He was at Bensington's now almost every day. Bensington, glancing from the window, would see the faultless equipage come spanking up Sloane Street, and after an incredibly brief interval, Winkles would enter the room with a light, strong motion, and pervade it, and protrude some newspaper, and supply information and make remarks. "Well," he would say, rubbing his hands, "how are we getting on?" And so pass to the current discussion about it. "Do you see," he would say, for example, "that Caterham has been talking about our stuff at the Church Association?" "Dear me," said Bensington, "that's a cousin of the Prime Minister, isn't it?" "Yes," said Winkles, "a very able young man, very able. Quite wrong-headed, you know, violently reactionary, but thoroughly able. And he's evidently disposed to make capital out of this stuff of ours. Takes a very emphatic line. Talks of our proposal to use it in the elementary schools." "Our proposal to use it in the elementary schools?" "I said something about that the other day, quite in passing, little affair at a polytechnic, trying to make it clear the stuff was really highly beneficial, not in the slightest degree dangerous in spite of those first little accidents, which cannot possibly occur again. You know it would be rather good stuff. But he's taken it up." "What did you say?" "Mere obvious nothings. But, as you see, takes it up with perfect gravity, treats the thing as an attack. Says there is already a sufficient waste of public money in elementary schools without this. Tells the old stories about piano lessons again, you know. No one, he says, wishes to prevent the children of the lower classes obtaining an education suited to their condition, but to give them a food of this sort will be to destroy their sense of proportion utterly. Expands the topic. What good will it do, he asks, to make poor people 36 feet high? He really believes, you know, that they will be 36 feet high." "So they would be," said Bensington, "if you gave them our food at all regularly. But nobody said anything." "I said something." "But, my dear Winkles—" "They'll be bigger, of course," interrupted Winkles, with an air of knowing all about it, and discouraging the crude ideas of Bensington. "Bigger, indisputably. But listen to what he says. Will it make them happier? That's his point. Curious, isn't it? Will it make them better? Will they be more respectful to properly constituted authority? Is it fair to the children themselves? Curious how anxious his sort are for justice, so far as any future arrangements go. Even nowadays, he says, the cost of feeding and clothing children is more than many of their parents can contrive, and if this sort of thing is to be permitted, eh? You see, he makes my mere passing suggestion into a positive proposal. And then he calculates how much a pair of breeches for a growing lad of 20 feet high or so will cost, just as though he really believed. £10, he reckons, for the merest decency. Curious man, this Catterham. So concrete. The honest and struggling ratepayer will have to contribute to that, he says. He says we have to consider the rights of the parent. It's all here, 2 columns. Every parent has a right to have his children brought up in his own size. Then comes the question of school accommodation, cost of enlarged desks and forms for our already too greatly burdened national schools. And to get what? A proletariat of hungry giants. Winds up with a very serious passage. Says even if this wild suggestion, mere passing fancy of mine, you know, and misinterpreted at that, this wild suggestion about the schools comes to nothing, that doesn't end the matter. This is a strange food, so strange as to seem to him almost wicked. It has been scattered recklessly, so he says, and it may be scattered again. Once you've taken it, it's poison unless you go on with it. So it is, said Bensington. And in short, he proposes the formation of a national society for the preservation of the proper proportions of things. Odd, eh? People are hanging on to the idea like anything. But what do they propose to do? Winkles shrugged his shoulders and threw out his hands. Form a society, he said, and fuss. They want to make it illegal to manufacture this Heracleophobia, or at any rate to circulate the knowledge of it. I've written about a bit to show that Catterham's idea of the stuff is very much exaggerated indeed, but that doesn't seem to check it. Curious how people are turning against it. And the National Temperance Association, by the by, has founded a branch for temperance in growth. Said Bensington, and stroked his nose. After all that has happened, there's bound to be this uproar. On the face of it, the thing's startling. Winkles walked about the room for a time, hesitated, and departed. It became evident that there was something at the back of his mind, some aspect of crucial importance to him that he waited to display. One day, when Redwood and Bensington were at the flat together, he gave them a glimpse of this something in reserve. "How is it all going?" he said, rubbing his hands together. "We're getting together a sort of report." "For the Royal Society?" "Yes." Said Winkles very profoundly, and walked to the hearthrug. But here's the point. Ought you?" "Ought we what?" "Ought you to publish?" "We're not in the Middle Ages," said Redwood. "I know." "As Cossar says, swapping wisdom, that's the true scientific method." "In most cases, certainly. But this is exceptional." "We shall put the whole thing before the Royal Society in the proper way," said Redwood. Winkles returned to that on a later occasion. "It's in many ways an exceptional discovery." "That doesn't matter," said Redwood. "It's the sort of knowledge that could easily be subject to grave abuse, grave dangers, as Catterham puts it." Redwood said nothing. Even carelessness, you know. If we were to form a committee of trustworthy people to control the manufacture of boom food, Heracleophobia, I should say, we might—" He paused, and Redwood, with a certain private discomfort, pretended that he did not see any sort of interrogation. Outside the apartments of Redwood and Bensington, Winkles, in spite of the incompleteness of his instructions, became a leading authority upon boom food. He wrote letters defending its use. He made notes and articles explaining its possibilities. He jumped up irrelevantly at the meetings of the scientific and medical associations to talk about it. He identified himself with it. He published a pamphlet called The Truth About Boom Food, in which he minimized the whole of the Hickley-Brow affair to almost nothing. He said that it was absurd to say boom food would make people 37 feet high. That was obviously exaggerated. It would make them bigger, of course, but that was all. Within that intimate circle of two, it was chiefly evident that Winkles was extremely anxious to help in the making of Heracleophobia, help in correcting any proofs there might be of any paper there might be in preparation upon the subject, do anything, indeed, that might lead up to his participation in the details of the making of Heracleophobia. He was continually telling them both that he felt it was a big thing, that it had big possibilities. If only they were safeguarded in some way. And at last, one day, he asked outright to be told just how it was made. "I've been thinking over what you said," said Redwood. "Well?" said Winkles brightly. "It's the sort of knowledge that could easily be subject to grave abuse," said Redwood. "But I don't see how that applies," said Winkles. "It does," said Redwood. Winkles thought it over for a day or so. Then he came to Redwood and said that he doubted if he ought to give powders about which he knew nothing to Redwood's little boy. It seemed to him it was uncommonly like taking responsibility in the dark. That made Redwood thoughtful. "You've seen that the Society for the Total Suppression of Boom Food claims to have several thousand members," said Winkles, changing the subject. "They've drafted a bill," said Winkles. "They've got young Caterham to take it up, readily enough. They're in earnest. They're forming local committees to influence candidates. They want to make it penal to prepare and store Heracleophobia without special license, and felony, matter of imprisonment without option, to administer boom food, that's what they call it, you know, to any person under 21. But there's collateral societies, you know, all sorts of people. The Society for the Preservation of Ancient Statures is going to have Mr. Frederick Harrison on the council, they say. You know he's written an essay about it, says it is vulgar and entirely inharmonious with that revelation of humanity that is found in the teachings of Comte. It is the sort of thing the 18th century couldn't have produced, even in its worst moments. The idea of the food never entered the head of Comte, which shows how wicked it really is. No one, he says, who really understood Comte." "But you don't mean to say," said Redwood, alarmed out of his disdain for Winkles. "They'll not do all that," said Winkles. "But public opinion is public opinion, and votes are votes. Everybody can see you are up to a disturbing thing. And the human instinct is all against disturbance, you know. Nobody seems to believe Caterham's idea of people 37 feet high, who won't be able to get inside a church or a meeting house or any social or human institution. But for all that, they're not so easy in their minds about it. They see there's something more than a common discovery." "There is," said Redwood, "in every discovery." "Anyhow, they're getting restive. Caterham keeps harping on what may happen if it gets loose again. I say over and over again it won't, and it can't. But there it is." And he bounced about the room for a little while, as if he meant to reopen the topic of the secret, and then thought better of it, and went. The two scientific men looked at one another. For a space, only their eyes spoke. "If the worst comes to the worst," said Redwood at last, in a strenuously calm voice. "I shall give the food to my little Teddy with my own hands." 3. It was only a few days after this that Redwood opened his paper to find that the Prime Minister had promised a royal commission on boom food. This sent him, newspaper in hand, round to Bensington's flat. "Winkles, I believe, is making mischief for the stuff. He plays into the hands of Caterham. He keeps on talking about it and what it is going to do, and alarming people. If he goes on, I really believe he'll hamper our inquiries, even as it is, with this trouble about my little boy." Bensington wished Winkles wouldn't. "Do you notice how he has dropped into the way of calling it boom food?" "I don't like that name," said Bensington with a glance over his glasses. "It is just so exactly what it is, to Winkles." "Why does he keep on about it? It isn't his." "It's something called booming," said Redwood. "I don't understand. If it isn't his, everybody is getting to think it is. Not that that matters." "In the event of this ridiculous agitation becoming serious," began Bensington. "My little boy can't get on without the stuff," said Redwood. "I don't see how I can help myself now. If the worst comes to the worst—" A slight bouncing noise proclaimed the presence of Winkles. He became visible in the middle of the room, rubbing his hands together. "I wish you'd knock," said Bensington, looking vicious over the gold rims. Winkles was apologetic. Then he turned to Redwood. "I'm glad to find you here," he began. "The fact is—" "Have you seen about this royal commission?" interrupted Redwood. "Yes," said Winkles, thrown out. "Yes." "What do you think of it?" "Excellent thing," said Winkles. "Bound to stop most of this clamour, ventilate the whole affair, shut up Caterham. But that's not what I came round for, Redwood. The fact is—" "I don't like this royal commission," said Bensington. "I can assure you it will be all right. I may say, I don't think it's a breach of confidence, that very possibly I may have a place on the commission." Said Redwood, looking into the fire. "I can put the whole thing right. I can make it perfectly clear, first, that the stuff is controllable, and secondly, that nothing short of a miracle is needed before anything like that catastrophe at Hickley-Brow can possibly happen again. That is just what is wanted, an authoritative assurance. Of course I could speak with more confidence if I knew, but that's quite by the way. And just at present there's something else, another little matter upon which I'm wanting to consult you. The fact is, well, I happen to be in a slight difficulty, and you can help me out." Redwood raised his eyebrows and was secretly glad. "The matter is highly confidential." "Go on," said Redwood. "Don't worry about that." "I have recently been entrusted with the child of an exalted personage." Winkles coughed. "You're getting on," said Redwood. "I must confess it's largely your powders, and the reputation of my success with your little boy. There is, I cannot disguise, a strong feeling against its use, and yet I find that among the more intelligent—one must go quietly in these things, you know, little by little. Still, in the case of her serene I mean this new little patient of mine, as a matter of fact, the suggestion came from the parent, or I should never—" He struck Redwood as being embarrassed. "I thought you had a doubt of the advisability of using these powders," said Redwood. "Merely a passing doubt." "You don't propose to discontinue—" "In the case of your little boy, certainly not." "So far as I can see, it would be murder." "I wouldn't do it for the world." "You shall have the powders," said Redwood. "I suppose you couldn't—" "No fear," said Redwood. "There isn't a recipe. It's no good, Winkles, if you'll pardon my frankness. I'll make you the powders myself." "Just as well, perhaps," said Winkles after a momentary hard stare at Redwood. "Just as well." And then, "I can assure you I really don't mind in the least." When Winkles had gone, Bensington came and stood on the hearthrug and looked down at Redwood. "Her Serene Highness," he remarked. "Her Serene Highness," said Redwood. "It's the Princess of Weser Dryburgh." No further than a third cousin. "Redwood," said Bensington, "it's a curious thing to say, I know, but do you think Winkles understands?" "What?" "Just what it is we have made. Does he really understand," said Bensington, dropping his voice and keeping his eye doorward, "that in the family of his new patient—" "Go on," said Redwood. "Who have always been, if anything, a little under... "The average?" "Yes, and so very tactfully undistinguished in any way. He is going to produce a royal personage, an outsized royal personage, of that size. You know, Redwood, I'm not sure whether there is not something almost treasonable." He transferred his eyes from the door to Redwood. Redwood flung a momentary gesture, index finger erect, at the fire. "By Jove," he said, "he doesn't know. That man," said Redwood, "doesn't know anything. That was his most exasperating quality as a student. Nothing. He passed all his examinations, he had all his facts, and he had just as much knowledge as a rotating bookshelf containing the Times Encyclopedia. And he doesn't know anything now. He's Winkles, and incapable of really assimilating anything not immediately and directly related to his superficial self. He is utterly void of imagination, and, as a consequence, incapable of knowledge. No one could possibly pass so many examinations, and be so well dressed, so well done, and so successful as a doctor, without that precise incapacity. That's it. And in spite of all he's seen and heard and been told, there he is. He has no idea whatever of what he has set going. He has got a boom on. He's working it well on boom food, and someone has let him into this new royal baby, and that's boomier than ever. And the fact that Weser Dryburgh will presently have to face the gigantic problem of a 30-odd-foot princess not only hasn't entered his head, but couldn't. It couldn't. "There'll be a fearful row," said Bensington. "In a year or so." "So soon as they really see she is going on growing." "Unless, after their fashion, they hush it up." "It's a lot to hush up." "Rather." "I wonder what they'll do." "They never do anything. Royal tact." "They're bound to do something." "Perhaps she will." "Oh, Lord, yes." "They'll suppress her. Such things have been known." Redwood burst into desperate laughter. "The redundant royalty, the bouncing babe in the iron mask," he said. "They'll have to put her in the tallest tower of the old Weser Dryburgh castle, and make holes in the ceilings as she grows from floor to floor. Well, I'm in the very same pickle, and Cossar and his 3 boys, and well, well." "There'll be a fearful row," Bensington repeated, not joining in the laughter. "A fearful row. I suppose," he argued, "you've really thought it out thoroughly, Redwood. You're quite sure it wouldn't be wiser to warn Winkles, wean your little boy gradually, and rely upon the theoretical triumph?" "I wish to goodness you'd spend half an hour in my nursery when the food's a little late," said Redwood, with a note of exasperation in his voice. "Then you wouldn't talk like that, Bensington. Besides, fancy warning Winkles. Now, the tide of this thing has caught us unawares, and whether we're frightened or whether we're not, we've got to swim." "I suppose we have," said Bensington, staring at his toes. "Yes, we've got to swim. And your boy will have to swim, and Cosser's boys. He's given it to all three of them. Nothing partial about Cosser, all or nothing. And Her Serene Highness, and everything. We are going on making the food. Cosser also. We're only just in the dawn of the beginning, Redwood. It's evident all sorts of things are to follow, monstrous great things. But I can't imagine them, Redwood, except... He scanned his fingernails. He looked up at Redwood with eyes bland through his glasses. "I've half a mind," he had ventured, "that Caterham is right, at times. It's going to destroy the proportions of things. It's going to dislocate... What isn't it going to dislocate?" "Whatever it dislocates," said Redwood, "my little boy must have the food." They heard someone falling rapidly upstairs. Then Cosser put his head into the flat. "Hello," he said at their expressions, and entering. "Well?" They told him about the princess. "Difficult question," he remarked. "Not a bit of it. She'll grow. Your boy'll grow. All the others you give it to'll grow. Everything. Like anything. What's difficult about that? That's all right. A child could tell you that. Where's the bother?" They tried to make it clear to him. "Not go on with it!" he shrieked. "But you can't help yourselves now. It's what you're for. It's what Winkles is for. It's all right. Often wondered what Winkles was for. Now it's obvious. What's the trouble? Disturbance? Obviously. Upset things? Upset everything. Finally, upset every human concern. Plain as a pikestaff. They're going to try and stop it, but they're too late. It's their way to be too late. You go on and start as much of it as you can. Thank God he has a use for you." "But the conflict," said Bensington. "The stress. I don't know if you have imagined—" "You ought to have been some sort of little vegetable, Bensington," said Cosser. "That's what you ought to have been. Something growing over a rockery. Here you are, fearfully and wonderfully made, and all you think you're made for is just to sit about and take your victuals. Do you think this world was made for old women to mop about in? Well, anyhow, you can't help yourselves now. You've got to go on." "I suppose we must," said Redwood. "Slowly." "No!" said Cosser in a huge shout. "No! Make as much as you can, and as soon as you can. Spread it about." He was inspired to a stroke of wit. He parodied one of Redwood's curves with a vast upward sweep of his arm. "Redwood," he said, to point the illusion, "make it so." 5. There is, it seems, an upward limit to the pride of maternity, and this, in the case of Mrs. Redwood, was reached when her offspring completed his 6th month of terrestrial existence, broke down his high-class bassinet perambulator, and was brought home bawling in the milk truck. Young Redwood at that time weighed 59½ pounds, measured 48 inches in height, and gripped about 60 pounds. He was carried upstairs to the nursery by the cook and housemaid. After that, discovery was only a question of days. One afternoon Redwood came home from his laboratory to find his unfortunate wife deep in the fascinating pages of The Mighty Atom, and at the sight of him she put the book aside and ran violently forward and burst into tears on his shoulder. "Tell me what you have done to him," she wailed. "Tell me what you have done." Redwood took her hand and led her to the sofa, while he tried to think of a satisfactory line of defense. "It's all right, my dear," he said. "It's all right. You're only a little overwrought. It's that cheap perambulator. I've arranged for a bath chair man to come round with something stouter tomorrow." Mrs. Redwood looked at him tearfully over the top of her handkerchief. "A baby in a bath chair," she sobbed. "Well, why not?" "It's like a cripple." "It's like a young giant, my dear, and you've no cause to be ashamed of him." "You've done something to him, Dandy," she said. "I can see it in your face." "Well, it hasn't stopped his growth, anyhow," said Redwood heartlessly. "I knew," said Mrs. Redwood, and clenched her pocket handkerchief ball fashion in one hand. She looked at him with a sudden change to severity. "What have you done to our child, Dandy?" "What's wrong with him?" "He's so big! He's a monster!" "Nonsense. He's as straight and clean a baby as ever a woman had. What's wrong with him?" "Look at his size!" "That's all right. Look at the puny little brutes about us. He's the finest baby." "He's too fine," said Mrs. Redwood. "It won't go on," said Redwood reassuringly. "It's just a start he's taken." But he knew perfectly well it would go on. And it did. By the time this baby was 12 months old, he tottered just 1 inch under 5 feet high, and scaled 8 stone 3. He was as big, in fact, as a St. Peter's in Vaticano cherub, and his affectionate clutch at the hair and features of visitors became the talk of West Kensington. They had an invalid's chair to carry him up and down to his nursery, and his special nurse, a muscular young person just out of training, used to take him for his airings in a Panhard 8 HP hill-climbing perambulator specially made to meet his requirements. It was lucky in every way that Redwood had his expert witness connection in addition to his professorship. When one got over the shock of little Redwood's enormous size, he was, I am told by people who used to see him, almost daily toifing slowly about Hyde Park, a singularly bright and pretty baby. He rarely cried or needed a comforter. Commonly he clutched a big rattle, and sometimes he went along hailing the bus drivers and policemen along the road outside the railings as "Dada" and "Baba" in a sociable, democratic way. "There goes that there great boom food baby," the bus driver used to say. "Looks healthy," the forward passenger would remark. "Bottle fed," the bus driver would explain. "They say it holds a gallon and had to be specially made for him." "Very healthy child anyhow," the forward passenger would conclude. When Mrs. Redwood realized that his growth was indeed going on indefinitely and logically, and this she really did for the first time when the motor perambulator arrived, she gave way to a passion of grief. She declared she never wished to enter her nursery again, wished she was dead, wished the child was dead, wished everybody was dead, wished she had never married Redwood, wished no one ever married anybody, ajaxed a little, and retired to her own room, where she lived almost exclusively on chicken broth for 3 days. When Redwood came to remonstrate with her, she banged pillows about, and wept and tangled her hair. "He's all right," said Redwood. "He's all the better for being big. You wouldn't like him smaller than other people's children." "I want him to be like other children, neither smaller nor bigger. I wanted him to be a nice little boy, just as Georgina Phyllis is a nice little girl, and I wanted to bring him up nicely, in a nice way, and here he is," and the unfortunate woman's voice broke, "wearing number 4 grown-up shoes and being wheeled about by petroleum. I can never love him," she wailed. "Never! He's too much for me. I can never be a mother to him, such as I'm meant to be." But at last they contrived to get her into the nursery, and there was Edward Monson Redwood, Pantagruel was only a later nickname, swinging in a specially strengthened rocking chair, and smiling and talking "goo" and "wow." And the heart of Mrs. Redwood warmed again to her child, and she went and held her in her arms and wept. "They've done something to you," she sobbed, "and you'll grow and grow, dear. But whatever I can do to bring you up nice, I'll do for you, whatever your father may say." And Redwood, who had helped to bring her to the door, went down the passage, much relieved. But it's a base job, this being a man, with women as they are." 6. Before the year was out, there were, in addition to Redwood's pioneer vehicle, quite a number of motor perambulators to be seen in the west of London. I am told there were as many as 11, but the most careful inquiries yield trustworthy evidence of only 6 within the metropolitan area at that time. It would seem the stuff acted differently upon different types of constitution. At first, Heracleophobia was not adapted to injection, and there can be no doubt that quite a considerable proportion of human beings are incapable of absorbing this substance in the normal course of digestion. It was given, for example, to Winkle's youngest boy, but he seems to have been as incapable of growth as, if Redwood was right, his father was incapable of knowledge. Others, again, according to the Society for the Total Suppression of Boom Food, became in some inexplicable way corrupted by it, and perished at the onset of infantile disorders. The Cossar boys took to it with amazing avidity. Of course, a thing of this kind never comes with absolute simplicity of application into the life of man. Growth, in particular, is a complex thing, and all generalizations must needs be a little inaccurate. But the general law of the food would seem to be this, that when it could be taken into the system in any way, it stimulated it in very nearly the same degree in all cases. It increased the amount of growth from 6 to 7 times, and it did not go beyond that, whatever amount of the food in excess was taken. Excess of Heracleophobia, indeed, beyond the necessary minimum, led, it was found, to morbid disturbances of nutrition, to cancer and tumors, ossifications, and the like. And once growth upon the large scale had begun, it was soon evident that it could only continue upon that scale, and that the continuous administration of Heracleophobia in small but sufficient doses was imperative. If it was discontinued while growth was still going on, there was first a vague restlessness and distress, then a period of voracity, as in the case of the young rats at Hankey, and then the growing creature had a sort of exaggerated anemia, and sickened and died. Plants suffered in a similar way. This, however, applied only to the growth period. So soon as adolescence was attained, in plants this was represented by the formation of the first flower buds, the need and appetite for Heracleophobia diminished, and so soon as the plant or animal was fully adult, it became altogether independent of any further supply of the food. It was, as it were, completely established on the new scale. It was so completely established on the new scale that, as the thistles about Hickley-brow and the grass of the downside already demonstrated, its seed produced giant offspring after its kind. And presently little Redwood, pioneer of the new race, first child of all who ate the food, was crawling about his nursery, smashing furniture, biting like a horse, pinching like a vice, and bawling gigantic baby talk at his nanny and mammy, and the rather scared and awe-stricken daddy who had set this mischief going. The child was born with good intentions. "Pada, be good, he used to say as the breakables flew before him. Pada was his rendering of Pantagruel, the nickname Redwood imposed on him. And Cossar, disregarding certain ancient lights that presently led to trouble, did, after a conflict with the local building regulations, get building on a vacant piece of ground adjacent to Redwood's home, a comfortable, well-lit playroom, schoolroom, and nursery for their 4 boys. 60 feet square, about, this room was, and 40 feet high. Redwood fell in love with that great nursery as he and Cossar built it, and his interest in curves faded, as he never dreamt it could fade, before the pressing needs of his son. "There is much," he said, "in fitting a nursery. Much. The walls, the things in it, they will all speak to this new mind of ours, a little more, a little less eloquently, and teach it, or fail to teach it, 1,000 things." "Obviously," said Cossar, reaching hastily for his hat. They worked together harmoniously, but Redwood supplied most of the educational theory required. They had the walls and woodwork painted with a cheerful vigor. For the most part, a slightly warmed white prevailed, but there were bands of bright, clean color to enforce the simple lines of construction. "Clean colors we must have," said Redwood, and in one place had a neat horizontal band of squares, in which crimson and purple, orange and lemon, blues and greens, in many hues and many shades, did themselves honor. These squares the giant children should arrange and rearrange to their pleasure. "Decorations must follow," said Redwood. "Let them first get the range of all the tints, and then this may go away. There is no reason why one should bias them in favor of any particular color or design." Then, "The place must be full of interest," said Redwood. "Interest is food for a child, and blankness torture and starvation. He must have pictures galore." There were no pictures hung about the room for any permanent service, however, but blank frames were provided into which new pictures would come and pass thence into a portfolio so soon as their fresh interest had passed. There was one window that looked down the length of a street, and in addition, for an added interest, Redwood had contrived above the roof of the nursery a camera obscura that watched the Kensington High Street and not a little of the gardens. In one corner that most worthy implement, an abacus, 4 feet square, a specially strengthened piece of ironmongery with rounded corners, awaited the young giant's incipient computations. There were few woolly lambs and such-like idols, but instead Cossor, without explanation, had brought one day in 3 four-wheelers a great number of toys, all just too big for the coming children to swallow. They could be piled up, arranged in rows, rolled about, bitten, made to flap and rattle, smacked together, felt over, pulled out, opened, closed, and mauled and experimented with to an interminable extent. There were many bricks of wood in diverse colors, oblong and cuboid, bricks of polished china, bricks of transparent glass, and bricks of India rubber. There were slabs and slates. There were cones, truncated cones, and cylinders. There were oblate and prolate spheroids, balls of varied substances, solid and hollow, many boxes of diverse size and shape, with hinged lids and screw lids and fitting lids, and 1 or 2 to catch and lock. There were bands of elastic and leather, and a number of rough and sturdy little objects of a size together that could stand up steadily and suggest the shape of a man. "Give 'em these," said Cossor, "one at a time." These things Redwood arranged in a locker in one corner. Along one side of the room, at a convenient height for a 6 or 8 foot child, there was a blackboard, on which the youngsters might flourish in white and colored chalk, and nearby a sort of drawing block, from which sheet after sheet might be torn, and on which they could draw in charcoal. And a little desk there was, furnished with great carpenter's pencils of varying hardness and a copious supply of paper, on which the boys might first scribble and then draw more neatly. And moreover Redwood gave orders, so far ahead did his imagination go, for specially large tubes of liquid paint and boxes of pastels against the time when they should be needed. He laid in a cask or so of plasticine and modeling clay. "At first he and his tutor shall model together," he said, "and when he is more skilful, he shall copy casts and perhaps animals. And that reminds me, I must also have made for him a box of tools. Then books. I shall have to look out a lot of books to put in his way, and they'll have to be big type. Now, what sort of books will he need? There is his imagination to be fed. That, after all, is the crown of every education. The crown, as sound habits of mind and conduct are the throne. No imagination at all is brutality. A base imagination is lust and cowardice. But a noble imagination is God walking the earth again. He must dream, too, of a dainty fairyland and of all the quaint little things of life in due time. But he must feed chiefly on the splendid real. He shall have stories of travel through all the world, travels and adventures, and how the world was won. He shall have stories of beasts, great books, splendidly and clearly done, of animals and birds and plants and creeping things, great books about the deeps of the sky and the mystery of the sea. He shall have histories and maps of all the empires the world has seen, pictures and stories of all the tribes and habits and customs of men. and he must have books and pictures to quicken his sense of beauty, subtle Japanese pictures to make him love the subtler beauties of bird and tendril and falling flower, and Western pictures too, pictures of gracious men and women, sweet groupings, and broad views of land and sea. He shall have books on the building of houses and palaces. He shall plan rooms and invent cities. I think I must give him a little theatre. Then there is music." Redwood thought that over, and decided that his son might best begin with a very pure-sounding harmonicon of 1 octave, to which afterwards there could be an extension. "He shall play with this first, sing to it, and give names to the notes," said Redwood. "And afterwards—" He stared up at the window-sill overhead, and measured the size of the room with his eye. "They'll have to build his piano in here," he said. "Bring it in pieces." He hovered about amidst his preparations, a pensive, dark little figure. If you could have seen him there, he would have looked to you like a 10-inch man amidst common nursery things. A great rug? Indeed, it was a Turkey carpet, 400 square feet of it, upon which young Redwood was soon to crawl, stretched to the grill-guarded electric radiator that was to warm the whole place. A man from Cossar's hung amidst scaffolding overhead, fixing the great frame that was to hold the transitory pictures. A blotting-paper book for plant specimens as big as a house door leant against the wall, and from it projected a gigantic stalk, a leaf-edge or so, and 1 flower of chickweed, all of that gigantic size that was soon to make Ershot famous throughout the botanical world. A sort of incredulity came to Redwood as he stood among these things. "If it really is going on," said Redwood, staring up at the remote ceiling. From far away came a sound like the bellowing of a mathicking bull, almost as if in answer. "It's going on, all right," said Redwood. "Evidently." There followed resounding blows upon a table, followed by a vast crowing shout. "Gulu! Boozoo! Bzzz!" "The best thing I can do," said Redwood, following out some divergent line of thought, "is to teach him myself." That beating became more insistent. For a moment it seemed to Redwood that it caught the rhythm of an engine's throbbing, the engine he could have imagined of some great train of events that bore down upon him. Then a descendant flight of sharper beats broke up that effect, and were repeated. "Come in," he cried, perceiving that someone rapped, and the door that was big enough for a cathedral opened slowly a little way. The new winch ceased to creak, and Bensington appeared in the crack, gleaming benevolently under his protruded baldness and over his glasses. "I've ventured round to see," he whispered in a confidentially furtive manner. "Come in," said Redwood, and he did, shutting the door behind him. He walked forward, hands behind his back, advanced a few steps, and peered up with a bird-like movement at the dimensions about him. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Every time I come in," he said, with a subdued note in his voice, "it strikes me as big." "Yes," said Redwood, surveying it all again also, as if in an endeavor to keep hold of the visible impression. "Yes, they're going to be big too, you know." "I know," said Bensington, with a note that was nearly awe. "Very big." They looked at one another, almost as it were, apprehensively. "Very big indeed," said Bensington, stroking the bridge of his nose, and with one eye that watched Redwood doubtfully for a confirmatory expression. "All of them, you know. Fearfully big. I don't seem able to imagine, even with this, just how big they're all going to be."